Our discussion about solving quadratic equations. And in this video, we are going to focus on how do we solve quadratic equations using the square root property. Okay, this is a highly exciting method. Well, it's highly useful. All right, let's look at this. Before we actually talk about this method, we do need to do a little bit of review to give you a little bit of backstory on why we do some of the things we do in this method. Okay, so let's just recall what we remember about these things. What do you remember about the square root of 4? Hopefully you said, well, that's easy, that's just 2, and you'd be right. What about the square root of -4? Ooh, it's tricky. Got to use your imagination, or at least an imaginary number, right? Because that would give us 2i. Or what if we said, what about negative square root of 4? Well, we already said that the square root of 4 was 2, so negative square root of 4 would then logically be -2. Okay, so those are a couple quickie reminders. Now let's take this a step further. We're going to look at this equation, x squared equals 4. Now remember, what we talked about last time was how to solve quadratic equations using factoring. And if we had this as an equation that we were going to solve using factoring, remember that we would set this equal to 0 first and then factor it, and this would be a difference of squares pattern. So we would say this is the same as x plus 2 times x minus 2 is equal to 0. And we would set each of those factors equal to 0 and say, well, x is equal to -2 or x is equal to +2. So that leads us to this important thing to remember. When you have an equation such as this, x squared equals 4, we need to remember that when we take the square root of both sides of this equation, we are finding all possible things that actually satisfy the equation. So we need both possibilities. So whenever you are taking the square root in an equation like this, we need to remember the plus or minus symbol there. And so we would end up with x is just equal to plus or minus 2, which is exactly what we found when we solved it by factoring. So this is really something key to keep in mind. It's a little bit different than what we're doing over here. Here we're just evaluating something, right? But over here we're talking about all solutions to this equation that actually satisfy this equation. All right, so down below here we've got 2 examples of equations that can be solved using the square root property. And to solve them, it's not really that difficult. There's more than one way to solve these kinds of equations, but we are focusing on using the square root property in this video. So we're going to look at what do we need to remember. Okay, the first thing you want to do in this case is you want to isolate whatever is being squared. You may have a variable being squared, or you may have a different expression being squared, but whatever is being squared needs to first be isolated. Then after you've got what's being squared isolated, you will take the square root of both sides of the equation, not all the pieces, but the entire side. And since we were working with an equation here, we are going to remember our plus or minus, and then we're going to simplify. Almost always, we will get 2 answers here. Now, will it always be 2 answers? No, we can get 1, and that's if we end up with something that's equal to 0. Otherwise, we're going to end up with 2 answers. So let's work through these examples. Okay, so in this left-hand example, what is being squared? What is this squared attached to? Now, if you said 2x, I would have to disagree with you because that squaring is only on the x. That means I want to isolate this x squared. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of the 3 by adding 3 to both sides. And then I would get rid of the 2 by dividing both sides by 2, and we would end up with x squared is equal to 64. Now notice, on the left side of the equation, the only thing that's there is something that's being squared. So now I can take the square root of both sides. And this is where I want to remember my plus or minus. I'm taking the square root of both sides, so I'm taking the square root of x squared, and that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of 64. Well, this left-hand side just becomes x because I'm using an inverse of a squaring. I'm taking a square root of a squared so that negate each other. So that will just end up being x. And we'd end up with x is equal to plus or minus 8. Now remember I said this is almost always two answers, and it's good to kind of write it out as if there are two answers. Sometimes it's easy to forget that plus or minus means two separate things. So writing it in this way is often a good thing. So our solution set is -8 and +8. All right, in this second example, think for a second of what is being squared. And if you said the 4, you'd be incorrect. Well, actually, we want the entire expression here, 3x minus 4. That whole thing is in parentheses and being squared. So this is what we want to isolate. So we want to get this other number over here, this other 3, out of here. And we'll do that by dividing both sides through by 3. When we do that, we get 3x minus 4, that quantity squared, is equal to 18. Now, that expression that's being squared is isolated. I can take the square root of both sides of the equation, remembering my plus or minus. So taking the square root of both sides gives me the square root of 3x minus 4 squared is equal to plus or minus the square root of 18. Now that left-hand side, I'm square rooting a squared, which means they're going to negate each other. My left-hand side will just end up being 3x minus 4. But my right-hand side, I can simplify that radical. The square root of 18 will break down into the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 9 we know is 3. So we can say that 3x minus 4 is equal to plus or minus 3 square root of 2. Now we will finish this by isolating the x. To do this, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I'll have 3x is equal to 4 plus or minus 3 rad 2. And then dividing everything through by 3. X is equal to 4 plus or minus 3 rad 2, all divided by 3. So what is our solution set? Well, our solution set here would be 4 plus 3 rad 2 over 3 and 4 minus 3 rad 2 over 3. Well, that's the nuts and bolts of solving quadratic equations using the square root property. In the next video, we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. I'll see you then.